Welcome, everyone. I think
Everybody.
I think everyone is in. It looks like we're not waiting on anybody else at this moment, so I think we're going to go ahead and start. I'd like to welcome you all to the Artist Outlook video series brought to you by the Appleton Museum of Art. I am the curator of the Appleton, Patricia Tomlinson, and tonight we have a very exciting guest, exciting and excitable guest. He is Max Stone. He has shot with National Geographic. He's been some of the most amazing places you can imagine. He is an environmental photographer, and his work is stunningly beautiful. So I hope you all will join me in welcoming Max Stone. Mac, can you tell us a little bit about yourself for people who may not be familiar with your work, please?
Sure. Everybody, thanks for being here. My name is Max Stone. I am originally from Gainesville, so not too far away from y'all there in Ocala. And I started photographing the swamps and wetlands and prairies and springs when I was in high school. And I am long out of high school now. And I have continued this mission to photograph unique places around the world. And most of my work still ends up being focused in Florida and the swamps and the wetlands around the country. And I do a lot of different kinds of things with my photography. I try different kinds of ways of taking images in unique ways, from remote cameras to drones to helicopters to underwater, putting my cameras inside road cones and in holes, pretty much anywhere and anything I can do to make a compelling photo and help tell the stories of these ecosystems that desperately need our love and attention. And sometimes, of the thousands and thousands and thousands of photos I make every year, one or two of them might be considered nice enough to thankfully be at the Appleton or or somewhere else, or in a magazine or online. So I've been very fortunate to work with some incredible organizations throughout my career, incredible magazines and publications as well. And all of this is kind of centered around the idea of conservation photography, photographing unique ecosystems or animals in a photojournalistic way that can hopefully bring about some positive change.
Well, that's wonderful. And one of the things I wanted to ask you is how did you get into wanting to document these fragile ecosystems? Was your family very outdoorsy and very much into the environment, or did you learn this more in college? How did this come about for you?
Yeah, my family was very outdoorsy. My parents always encouraged us to be outside. And I'm the youngest. I have two older brothers, and I'm the youngest. And just growing up in Gainesville, the thing to do for us, it wasn't sit and watch TV. It was go out and hang out in the forest and go look for fossilized shark's teeth in the creeks. It was just a kind of a life outdoors. It was just very natural for us. My dad, when I was in high school, we would go on these spring break trips to different places around the country. Just he and I, paddling in the Wilderness Waterway in the Everglades, or biking the C&O Canal, just kind of adventure trips. So being in the outdoors was something that was very natural and very normal for me. Um, and it just kind of, this is how it always happens, right? The more you do something, the more you see something, the more you begin to understand it, and the more you understand it and the more you know about it, the more you come to love it. And it just became kind of natural that I would become an advocate for some of these places. And just right around that time, where I was getting outside a lot and also getting my own freedom by turning 16 and being able to drive places, I also picked up a camera from my parents' closet, an old Minolta SRT 101, a film camera. And that became kind of the excuse for me to go have adventures. Like, I would go out for the purpose of finding and doing something interesting so that I could make photos. And it just became this obsession that I wanted more and more to take better and better photos every time I went out. And so I became a student photography very quickly. And I really looked up to, and I still look up to, John Moran, who was kind of the Florida laureate photographer. And I picked his brain, he took me out on many outings growing up. And in that style of photography, his style really made an impression on me because it came from such a place of love and connection with your surroundings. And I thought that really shone through in his work, and it's something that I still try to do today.
That's wonderful, and thank you for saying that, because one of the things I did want to discuss tonight was your influences. Now, in addition to him, did you have any other mentors or any other influences that really kind of got you down the path?
Sure. Yeah, I did. Randy Batista, who's also another local photographer, and he did a lot of fine and art, black and white portraiture. I learned a lot from him just in terms of form and composition. Also, I really looked up to Jeff Ripple. I had a lot of his work. And Clyde Butcher, of course, too. And all of their work is very different from the type of work I do now. But it was influential in the sense of like how I always looked at making images as kind of like this engineering problem of like, how do I deconstruct their images to figure out how they made them? And and so then the images that I wanted to go make were ones that I would try to dream up and try to kind of construct in my mind's eye and then go out and take and go out and make in the field, which is always a lot harder than it seemed like, drawing at my desk. But their work in particular, in terms of local photographers, I really, really looked up to a photographer named Galen Rowell, who was a California-based photographer. This is when I was, I guess, late high school, early college. I was really getting into him because he was an adventure photographer. So among many other things, and a philosopher, and he had a really great ethos about photography and what it meant, personally, and in terms of communication. He would travel all over the world. Unfortunately, he passed away in a plane accident. But his photography would really push the limits. He would run 8 miles to go climb a mountain to shoot a photo of a rainbow that was perfectly placed over this Tibetan monastery. Like he would go to any lengths it would take to make a photo. And I think that was very impressionable for me. I love Nick Nichols, great wildlife photographer with National Geographic. Joel Sartori is another National Geographic photographer that I looked up to at a very young age. And then as my career has gone on, I mean, I have dozens and dozens of people I look up to because, I mean, it's an art form. Like there are so many different ways of doing it. And everybody has a little bit different approach and spin and style the way that they go for it. So I feel like my style and vision is constantly evolving.
Well, that makes perfect sense. And since you gave me the perfect segue, I'm going to put on the PowerPoint, and I wanted to discuss some of your work. So let's take a look at that. Okay, let me get into the first piece. So one of the things I wanted to discuss with you is, in a lot of the pieces that I've seen of yours, you have the fisheye view, if you will. You're in the water looking out as if you were a in this particular one, as if you were a sea creature or something. And I think that perspective is really fascinating because you're one of the creatures looking out. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, and you'll definitely see that style. I would say that style of what you're talking about, at least the way I'm interpreting it, we'll definitely see that in some of my other work, where you have this very close foreground, but also expansive background, a foreground that brings you into the rest of the image. It's a very powerful way of engaging a viewer. It's a way of, when you look at the image, you feel like you're in it, inside of it. And that's always what I go for. I'm trying to immerse the viewer in the scene. And you have a whole bunch of different ways of doing that. And of course, the way is to not just capture what you see, but to try and force a perspective or force a viewpoint from the viewer. So the way that I actually did this one, this is such a typical scene in a way in South Florida in the Everglades. You have these massive supercells and these squalls that come through, and they just dump loads and loads of water in these very, like, seems like a tortured location, just to get that much rain in one place, and raging skies. And so it's a fairly common thing to do. And I would always go and look for these. So we'd go out boating and looking for these to make compelling images, because the skies are so unique in South Florida in the summertime. But what was happening here is that the wind was creating these waves, these kind of peaks and troughs. And what I did is I turned the boat sideways to the waves. There weren't big waves, they're just kind of, these rolling waves. I turned the boat sideways. I put my hand on the bottom of the camera, and I dunked my hand in the water so I knew where the water level was. And without looking, I put my camera down into the trough, so it's actually looking up at the peak of this to eliminate the horizon and create this view like you're about to drop over the edge of the earth.
It's really powerful. I think it talks also about the vastness of nature itself. So I think this is it's really quite simple because it's the sky and water, yet it speaks volumes.
Well, and also speaks in terms of a narrative, which is what I was working on with this body of work, is to try and tell the story of the Everglades. And so much of the story of the Everglades is tied to water. And this image to me represents so many different things. It's like the rain that comes down is what fuels the whole river of grass system. It's like it fills up the cup. And with the rest of the body of work that's part of this series, you begin to find out what happens with that water. It gets diked and dammed and levied and diverted and everything. And it's not as simple as it should be. Like, this is such a simple concept. Rain falls down, it fills up this wetland. That's the way it should work. And unfortunately, it's not the way it works anymore. But to me, this is a powerful scene.
Absolutely, absolutely. So moving on to the next one, I think this also, of course, is very much, you're in the photo as if you were an insect or, some kind of creature that lives in this environment.
Yeah, that's I love that. This is an American lotus. This is shot in Gainesville on Kanapaha Prairie. And growing up, American lotus were the most fascinating plants to me because they're huge. They're really big. And if you ever wade out into a wetland, sometimes, depending on how deep it is, they'll be up to your chest. Like, they are big flowers and very alien looking seed pods once they lose the flowers. So I was always fascinated by them. I've taken a million different photos of these flowers in so many different ways. One where, with the fisheye lens, where they're just like splayed out everywhere and you feel like you're a fish swimming underneath them. There's big storms raging behind them. And when it finally worked for me, and I like those images too, but this is all kind of the editorial art process. It's all about distillation in a way. And when passing by these one day, I just loved the grouping of these. It's like you had all phases of the flower in one little box, in one little viewpoint. And I tried to approach this in a way like I was making a portrait of a famous person. I sat down and I worked this probably for about 45 minutes, just really trying to avoid, all the, tangencies, trying to just arrange it just right. So it was like I was sitting down doing a portrait session with this flower.
That's actually really fascinating. That I love that it's the Beyonce of lotuses.
Yeah, I think a lot of times people, well, photography it's many different things, right? It's maybe it's sometimes it's just a quick photo you take with your phone now to remember something. Maybe it's just something you do in passing. But it really can be a window to the soul, I think. And it takes time to do it. And I begrudgingly took the time when I first started and sat down to make this frame. I was like, here I go again, Mac. What are you going to do? You're going to shoot this lotus. There's nothing you can do new here. And I just worked it. And I was just really pleased with this one.
Yeah, it's a beautiful piece. So let's go to the next one. We have this fun fellow, maybe it's male, in the tree. You want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. This is a limpkin. These are really, really neat birds. You've probably heard them if you've ever lived around them. They just make this bizarre trumpet call. They're wonderful, wonderful wetland birds, and they mostly eat little aquatic snails. And so most of the time when you see them, you're seeing them in and around, Cyprus or just in the water or something like that. And I was on Payne's Prairie, and I saw this limpkin starting to walk up this live oak bough. And instinctually, my first instinct as a wildlife photographer is to make like a portrait or zoom in, get as close as you can on something. And I fought the urges this time, and just was like, I'm going to keep my wide lens on, and I'm just going to try and show it in its little scene. And fortunately, the scene was just this incredible Spanish moss, backlit habitat as it's walking through the boughs of this tree. Just a really fun moment, just all the different lines coming in and crisscrossing and bringing you to that limpkin.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say. The diagonals really kind of draw you in, but then after you find him, so to speak, your eye keeps traveling outside of the picture plane. So you understand inherently there's a lot more to this story and a lot more to the tree than that you're seeing in this particular image. So I think that's really, it has a level of, I don't want to say, I guess, drama in a way, because the lighting also, even though it's very soft, it's also kind of dramatic lighting.
Yeah, it's like a quiet drama in a way. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, cool. So let's look at the next one. We have this charming owl in the center of the photograph. Can you tell us a little bit about this fellow?
This one kind of harkens back to what you were saying during Edge of the Earth, is that the approach of going with a wide angle and having an engaging foreground to lead you into a background, to make you feel part of a scene. That's one of my favorite ways of shooting. And it works for landscapes, but it also really works. It's harder to do, but when you can do it, when you can find ways of doing it, it really works in a fun way with wildlife. It's one of my favorite ways of photographing wildlife, is trying to come up with unique ways to get into their world. And this is a burrowing owl, which is an owl that's about this tall, and they live underground. So its burrow, its nest is right behind it. And I've taken thousands and thousands of photos of these birds, and this one just spoke to me because it has this posture of kind of more than an animal. It has this engaging look, that it's interacting with the audience, and you also get to see its home. You get to see all of it, the prairie grassland where it lives, mixed with the kind of dark, stormy skies of summer that is so characteristic of Florida. And the way this image actually came into the world, was that this is taken at an airfield in South Florida, right outside Everglades National Park. And in the airfield, because they have to keep, trees can't grow up in an airfield because it's risky for planes. So it has created this prairie habitat. Well, flat prairie habitats, uplands in particular, is exactly where these birds like to nest. And so, and by having this airfield, this burrowing owl, which are threatened because of loss of habitat, was able to live there. And the management company for the airline marked all the burrows with road cones to make sure that the landscaping company wouldn't mow over the burrows and the birds. So I grabbed a road cone and I cut a hole in it and I put my camera inside the road cone, and it would take pictures throughout the day. And that's how I ended up getting images like this.
Okay, so you answered my next question, because I was thinking, were you lying on your belly and just waiting for this owl to emerge from its burrow, or how are you doing this?
No, and I did that. I have photos like that with a with a telephoto lens where everything is compact, but you'll never get this kind of I don't know. There's like a pride in him. He's kind of puffing up his chest, but he's also relaxed. He's not agitated, and you wouldn't be able to get that type of thing unless you used a remote camera. So the remote cameras really allow you to back away and see things as they just would naturally play out, kind of be a fly on the wall and just capture those little moments. We always love to anthropomorphize animals, but there's just so much character in this bird. It's just one of my favorites.
Yeah, he reminds me of like some revolutionary fellow in his waistcoat and looking very proper in his breeches.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. He's got so much to him, and those big old eyes too. Yeah, he's beautiful.
Yeah, it's very wonderful. Now, also, before I move on to the next one, I kind of wanted to ask you as well, when you're taking these photographs, are you already aware of, for example, is this an endangered species? Do you go in there specifically because you know that? Can you talk a little bit about, the environmental aspect of the particular some of the particular animals that you're shooting?
Yeah. So, great question. Sometimes, if it's in particular, if I'm working on a specific story that hinges on the animal being an endangered or threatened species, then yes, I go in and I do as much research as I can about the animal, so I can find out where it's living, what its behavior is, and then that will start giving me ideas of images I could possibly make too. Also, it allows me to make the connections and talk with the biologists and the people who are dedicating their lives to protecting these animals, because you can't just go and work closely or put cameras close to threatened or endangered species without there being some permission or permitting. So, I don't recommend that people do that just on their own. You really want to work with biologists and people who could tell you what is too close and what's not, to be able to make images like that. But there's always a lot of planning going on. For this one, this is part of my Everglades body of work. So this is really trying to tell the story of one of the unique creatures that calls the Everglades home that people rarely get to see. And they don't get to see these birds because there's just not a lot of habitat left for them. Everything that's high, dry, and flat down there has been developed.
Wow, poignant story. Moving on to, oh, see, I'm not from Florida, and I have to say, gators scare me to death. So I want to know what kind of crazy thing happened for you to get this shot, Mac.
This one was actually crazy. This is not a remote camera. This camera was in my hand, and it's that same style, right? The wide angle close up, with the alligators this time leading you back into the habitat. One of the things that it makes the Everglades so unique, is that it is dominated by seasonality. I know we don't you're not supposed to have seasons in Florida, but there are very clear seasons and hydrological seasons in the Everglades. There's a wet season and then there's a dry season. And in the dry season, if water is not making its way down south to Big Cypress or Everglades National Park, and if that dry season is prolonged, you end up having situations like this, where even top predators like alligators are relegated to being packed into a very small space just to stay wet and to be able to hang out, because they're not going to just survive in a dry forest. They have to stay wet. And so a lot of times they'll all congregate into these last remaining what are called gator holes. These are areas gators have excavated over the years so that they can survive these long drought conditions. I had found this spot a couple months before with another photographer and friend, but there was a lot of water left in it. So I kind of waited out the drought conditions, and I returned when I knew the water was much lower. And with another friend, a very brave friend, we walked out into the middle of this congregation of alligators. And it was winter. They were very sluggish. You know, they're not interested in me or my friend. They're really just waiting for the rains to return. And I slogged out there. Some gators were buried under the mud. There were 60 just in this photograph. But in there, I think we're well over 100 in this gator hole area. And there are some in the mud you could feel as you were walking, like you would step on a tail or something. It was not great. So, but I kept making my way to get to this alligator so I could make this frame. So if you were to see this one, big, you'll just sit there for, 5 minutes trying to count all the alligator backs that you see. But it's the image kind of has multiple purposes. One, it's to inform about the need for returning fresh water back to South Florida since it's been diverted and redirected. Another purpose is to show this incredible natural behavior that happens and ways that alligators have come up with for surviving. But it's also to try and make predators, even top prehistoric predators like an alligator, show that they too can be vulnerable in this system. So it was probably one of the hairiest things I've done to make an image. At the time, it didn't feel that way. I felt totally relaxed. Actually, so relaxed that after making this photo, and I'm probably, I don't know, a foot away from this gator, and up to my thighs in the mud, and crouched over. As soon as I took the photo, I just was like, oh man, that was great. And I just stood up, went fully up. And as soon as I did that gator just slapped its tail on the mud, and there was a stampede of alligators, which is not what I was going for. I really didn't want to bother them at all. It was an unfortunate consequence, but thankfully they went the other way. And I just lost kind of momentary awareness, which doesn't happen often to me, but it happened there.
Goodness gracious! See, my heart just kind of stopped. So I want to make sure I understand what you're saying. So these gator holes, this isn't necessarily a climate change thing. This does normally happen seasonally.
That's correct. Yes, it seasonally, the wet season and the dry season, those two seasons are very distinct from one another. And so, yes, climate change could exacerbate it, but really what has been the main driver of how severe some of these droughts are has been the fact that water has been diverted and rerouted from its historic path out the east and west instead of allowing to flow south. So the big push right now, the big movement, is to send water south to Everglades National Park. And this is something a lot of people don't really understand. I mean, Florida is a state that seems blessed with water, right? We have springs and so many wetlands, but if you start redirecting water and sending it to estuaries and coastal communities that aren't historically supposed to receive those waters, you disrupt this whole delicate system. And that's what's happened in South Florida in the Everglades. Water has not been allowed to flow south. And even though you establish Everglades National Park, if you don't bring the inputs that actually make that park unique to the park, then all the protection and all the borders you put up won't help it. So water is the key thing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, sort of a poignancy there too. So let's look at the next one. And I want to talk to you a little bit, not only obviously about this gorgeous photograph, but also about your series. You had mentioned that you had an Everglades series. Can you kind of talk us through some other series that you have explored?
Yeah, actually, this is another good example of another series I did. This one is called Hang the Moon. This print is called Hang the Moon, and also the series is called Hang the Moon. And this was a collaboration with the International Dark Sky Association. And the effort here was to try and show not only that camping outside under the stars is a lot of fun in a hammock, but also to highlight the night skies as a natural resource. And a lot of times we don't think about the stars being a resource, but if you've ever lived in a big city and you go out at night and you don't see the stars, you realize just how much you miss them. Especially if you're from rural areas where sitting out on your porch and looking at the stars is a common thing. So the more lands we lose, wild lands we lose, the more green space we lose, we also lose our ability to see the night sky. So Hang the Moon was a campaign, was a series where I went and I would take self-portraits. So this is me in the hammock. I would camp all over Southeast. I even did it out in Wyoming in a hammock underneath the night sky. And I would illuminate the hammock with flashlights or my iPhone that I had, and I would take these self-portraits. So this is actually two images in one. Because I didn't have a friend there with me making this one. So I got behind the tree and I lit with my flashlight behind the tree, and then I climbed into my hammock, and that's me there illuminating the hammock. And I combined those two images into one.
So walk me through where your camera, so was your camera off in a boat? Because obviously this is on the water.
Yeah, so my camera is actually sitting on top of a 10-foot tall tripod. This is in the middle of not in the middle of a lake, but out in a deep lake. So I have this really tall tripod that I took out there, and I would. It's very hard to make self-portraits, especially if you are on the water, because any little thing you need to change, you have to get down, paddle over to it, change it. It's sitting just like maybe this far off the water. So if an alligator bumps it, you're in deep trouble. But I then hooked up, I created this Wi-Fi network on my camera using a device called a Cam Ranger. So once I paddled over to the tree, I could sit there in the hammock and look at my phone to dial in all the settings I need to with my camera. The only thing I can't do, obviously, is change the position. So, once that moon starts, move, actually the earth, once the earth starts moving and the moon changes positions in the sky, then I have to like paddle and then go change things. So I wanted it to look like the moon was creating all that light.
It really does. It's there's a fairyland aspect to it that if people are Tolkien fans on here, Middle Earthish, it's very interesting.
Well, thank you, and it's a way to. I feel like a lot of time I'm scratching the itch of my inner 8-year-old, trying to make images that if I were a child and I saw, I'd say, oh, I want to go do that. like, how do I go do that? And also showing that, our type of wilderness and our brand of experiencing the outdoors is unique in its own right in the low country. And it's also something to be proud of, so uh, this image had multiple purposes. Now with this Hang the Moon campaign that the Grand Trunk Hammock Company also put out there, we put out this hashtag to challenge people to go out and make their own nighttime photos. And we got thousands of kids all over the US sending in nighttime photos of them camping in hammocks, which is really fun.
That's wonderful. That kind of
Yeah.
brings it all home of why you're doing it, That's cool. So let's look at the next one. And I feel that there's a story either about to happen or talk to us a little bit about this image, please.
Yeah, this one was made in Bidler Forest in South Carolina, and this is one of the ancient swamps left in the country. And there's this log. This is a big old cypress limb that had probably come down during Hugo, and it just sat in the middle of this lake. And this log had become the most popular place for all the cold-blooded animals that normally frequent swamps. So all the turtles and gators would just flock to this thing. And so I rigged up a device that would allow me to mount my camera onto the log and take pictures throughout the day on this kind of rolling timer. And I did this for several weeks at a time. It would rain. My camera almost got knocked over. There's lots of kind of moments, but it revealed this really neat, calm balance that you don't typically think of when you think of swamps. You always think of it to be this really gnarly, out to get you place. And if you are low on the totem pole, you're going to get eaten and that's it. But like there was this really neat balance that was happening on this log. Sometimes it'd be full of just entirely turtles lined up the whole way. Or sometimes it would be gator, turtle, gator, turtle, gator. And then sometimes it would be all gators just occupying it. But then, this image came and there was just this kind of, I don't know, posture and like you said, tension to it that you're not sure what's about to happen. This turtle is kind of looking back over him and there's lots of lines coming in. It just worked. And so I just love this. I love this scene. This one was also awarded in BBC's Wildlife Photographer of the Year competition. And so, it's been a great way to bring the swamps to a wider audience, which has been really nice. And this is ultimately, what the goal is to try to create these unique windows of the world, like try to see what a perspective of another turtle or another gator might look like.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. It's a very dynamic image. It's really great. Let's go on to the next one. Now, I have a lot of questions about this one too, so I'll let you speak first, and then if anything comes up, I'll ask if you don't cover it.
No, you tell me. What do you think? What are we looking at?
Well, it looks like it's digitally manipulated, but I don't know. So I mean, obviously there's that oily sheen, but that doesn't look, I don't want to say natural, but it looks like it's manipulated in order to have done that.
Fair enough. Well, I'm always upfront with the images that have been manipulated at all. So like the one where I'm in the hammock, I always reveal if something is a double exposure, but I never add elements that aren't there. I never take away elements from my images. So this is a natural occurring scene, and this is made in the Bidler Forest as well. And this is part of a new series that I'm working on called Old Growth, and it's documenting what happens in the old growth swamps that are left in the U.S. And old growth swamps are, they are some of the most fascinating places because they're less than 1% remaining. So all of our swamps all across the Southeast, millions of acres were cut down. And so this series explores what happens in these ancient ecosystems that still remain. And there are only a handful of them left. And Byler Forest is one of them. And what's interesting, what's happening here is I was returning from a shoot, just slogging. This is what I do. I just go out and slog in swamps and look for things. And I was slogging back. It was about to get to be night. And as I'm slogging back, I see this sheen on top of the water. And I've seen it before. I've seen it in many different ways, but I've never had a really good opportunity of photographing it. And this one presented itself just so perfectly. It looks like a crescent moon that's rising. And so what I did is, again, eliminating the horizon, and I pointed my camera down, took a 30-second exposure to make it look like this crescent moon is rising over this canopy of trees when you're actually looking at the reflection of trees in the water. And so this oily sheen is actually on top of the water. And people who have been out in swamps might have seen something like this kind of oil slick, and it looks like it's a contamination, when in fact it's all about actually how swamps work. And forests that are submerged for long parts of the year, you have bacteria that helps break down iron, or helps break down leaves and decomposition. But because it's underwater, it's anaerobic bacteria. And what is released from as a byproduct of that decomposition is this kind of iron sheen that comes on the water. And this one just had such a unique shape to it that I ended up calling it midnight oil.
That's amazing. I honestly, until you started speaking more, didn't even realize I was looking at a reflection until you started to kind of talk about how you set it up. And I was like, oh, goodness. Okay. That's really
Yeah.
cool.
Yeah, it's a shame that we now jump the first thought. Now we're like, oh well, how do you manipulate that? And it's because we don't know what to believe anymore. But this is just one of those really unique situations that you come across. And I haven't released this series yet, so this is kind of a sneak peek into it. But I'm showing this one because it also placed in the Big Picture competition, which is an international competition based out of the California Academy of Sciences. So, when I show this to people, they're like, "Oh, cool Photoshop," but this is just one of those little gifts that the swamp gives you sometimes.
That's it. It's very cool. And one of the things, as we show the next one, this is the piece that the Appleton Museum of Art owns of Max. And one of the things I wanted to really touch on, number one, the story about this is fascinating. So I would really like you to talk about that, Mac. But also, this is a good finale to all of the lead up that you've been talking about, when really this is patience. You have to have patience when you're dealing with wild animals and things you cannot control or manipulate. Could you sort of talk a little bit about that, please?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you also for having this in your collection. It means a lot to me. This is a particularly meaningful image. I wouldn't say that it's a great symbol of my patience, because I'm an Amazon user too. I don't have patience. I'm more than anything, I'm bullheaded, and I'm just stubborn. That I will keep going and going and going until I can get it. So this actually is the cover of my book, Everglades America's Wetland, and this is an image I wanted to make while producing this book, because this bird is really unique to the state of Florida. So this is called the Everglades snail kite. And it's a really fascinating bird because it's one of the most specialized raptors in the entire world. And specialized meaning that it really only eats one thing. It eats an aquatic gastropod called an apple snail. Their story is intrinsically tied to kind of the peaks and valleys of our relationship with that wetland, that as we started diverting that water and draining it and eliminating habitat for wetlands, we lost habitat for the snail. And when you lose the habitat for the snail of one of the most specialized raptors in the world, they quickly become an endangered species. So at the time of this photograph, there were probably around 300 to 400 of these pairs left. And I had unique permissions from state wildlife biologists to attempt this. And it's one of the rare instances too where I've ever put out food for an animal. I do not condone baiting wildlife, but since my rationale here, and ones that the biologists were okay with, was that these birds only eat one thing. And so you can't really manipulate their behavior by offering them the thing that they eat. And I would find these snails by walking around barefoot just right around this area and picking them up with my toes. So these snails come up to the top of the water column to breed or mate or lay eggs. And in those moments when they're up at the top of the water column, that's when these birds will fly down, grab them with their talons, and then they have this hooked beak that can pry out the meat from the shell. They have these very broad wings that can soar over these wetlands for long periods of time as they're looking for it. It's really cool. And actually during this time of trying to make this photo, we would try to fool the birds. Not really fool, it's just try to see what they would do. So we would take old snail shells that were long ago discarded. We would pack them with mud, me and the biologist, and we would put them out, and the birds would never once go for it. So they're really cueing in to little tiny micro movements from these snails to know when to come down and pick them up. And you're of course seeing the end result. So it kind of seems like, well, it just happened, but this is one that took months of planning and weeks out in the field of just sitting and waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, moving this whole rig and setup into new locations until finally finding a location that this kite could zero in on. And it was just a wonderful moment when it happened. It took several weeks of going out into this wetland of Lake Okeechobee and just worked great. I just would sit there waist deep in the water for basically 9-hour shifts all day, waiting and waiting and waiting. But it finally paid off.
It really is a spectacular photo and such a gorgeous bird. So it does kind of, the minute I found out from you that they do only eat that one gastropod, that's it, I immediately felt sad because that we all know resources are finite, and it does make me truly concerned about the welfare of these majestic, beautiful animals.
Well, and that's a great point. And that's kind of the thing is I think the general public, we don't really understand all these unique interconnected ties that exist. Like everyone can understand that when you drain a wetland, the wetland's gone, there's no more wetland there. But everything that happens in there and everything that has happened in there for millennia has led to the point where these animals are able to survive or not. And this is just one of those animals that is so directly and irrefutably connected to the health of a system that they kind of become this ambassador, this iconic species or indicator species for the health of a wetland. And I'm happy to say their numbers are rebounding now, but it's not for the reasons we would want it to be. It's not because of just the increased health of the wetland. What has happened now is these birds have started finding and being able to eat larger size snails, which are invasive snails. So they're queuing into these what are called island apple snails from Brazil. But these invasive snails have also allowed these birds to start thriving again. So it presents this real conundrum of, what is good and what is bad.
Indeed, because you always hear invasive species, oh, gotta go, invasive species. But here in this particular instance, it turns out to kind of be a good thing in a way.
Maybe, but the scientists also don't know what the impacts of this invasive snail are going to be for other things. Maybe it outcompetes the native snail. Maybe, I mean, it definitely does. It reproduces a lot more. It's huge, and they've also think that there's toxicity in the amount of hydrilla that they eat, so it can actually poison animals. So the jury's out.
Gosh, okay, okay. Well, let's go back to the regular screen. So I will get us back here. One of the things that you sort of have touched on that I kind of wanted to talk to you a little bit about too, because of course the Appleton Museum of Art is owned by the College of Central Florida. What would you say, Mac? You're a successful photographer. What would you say to a young person who really is inspired by you and your work and maybe wants to go into this line of work? What words of wisdom would you have for them?
Great question. Um, it used to be that the field of photography was relatively small. You would have photographers that would become experts, and then that could then go parachute into areas and tell stories and then come back, and they become the trusted voice, for issues all around the world. That model has somewhat changed now. There are so many talented photographers all over the world. And what I am always most intrigued by, and the art that I love to see, is the art coming from photographers who have a deep and intimate knowledge of where they live, and generally that those images speak to me more. So while everyone rushes to Arches National Park or the Grand Canyon or Kenya or to these iconic photo locations all around the world, to me, the people who are pushing the boundaries and making really innovative art are the ones who are really exploring their backyards and their local wildernesses in a deep and meaningful way. So if you're going into photography, in particular nature photography or conservation photography, I would say work your backyard and your local areas as much as you can, because no one's going to see them in the same way that you do. And it's cheaper. It's easier to do, and at least to get started. But yeah, I would say it's the, again, maybe it's cliche, but it's the what is it? Think globally and act locally. It's how I started, and I still can't shake the bonds that I have with my hometown and my home state. Even though I do now have the opportunity to travel all over the world and shoot different stories, I still love coming back and exploring these habitats.
Well, and before we get on to the questions, we have questions showing up in chat, which is lovely. One thing I did want to touch on quickly that I've asked the other artists thus far in this series too is obviously COVID-19 has disrupted a lot of things. And you and I were chatting before we went live that, COVID-19 has disrupted some of your travel plans as well. Can you talk just a little bit about that? And then we'll get on to everyone's questions in the chat box. And also, everyone, I wanted to let you know, we are looking at your questions in the chat box. If you have questions for Mac that we haven't covered, please feel free to write them in chat, and we will try to get to absolutely as many of those as we can.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. COVID affected. I mean, everybody knows COVID affected the gig industry really hard, and especially for those of us who are used to traveling all the time. It put the brakes on it. I had a number of assignments that were just completely stopped and canceled. And I remember, in February and January, people saying, "Oh, well, let's just see where this goes." I was like, "Guys, this is this is going to get worse and worse. So let's just go ahead and cancel. I was supposed to be in Madagascar. I had flights scheduled all up and down the southeast coast, shooting aerials with pilots for my old growth project. That was all canceled. And even the two of the swamps that I was photographing in, Corkscrew down in the Everglades and Byler Forest in South Carolina for this old growth project, those were even shut down. So I couldn't even go to these wilderness areas. So it affected me big time, I'd say. But it also allowed me the opportunity to stay at home for a whole year, which was really nice because we just had a son in last November. So I got to watch him grow up for a full year and be home, which was really, really great. So that was nice. So I also had an opportunity that probably wouldn't have come if not for COVID, and that was getting to photograph a really unique natural phenomenon that happens in South Carolina in Congaree National Park, where you have this firefly species called Photurus frontalis. And this firefly is fairly unique than those around the world in that it synchronizes with fireflies around it. So once the sun sets, all of a sudden these little lights start turning on in the swamp, and then they start blinking in unison. And it is just the wildest thing. And I got the opportunity to go because COVID stopped the whole firefly festival that they usually have. And Congaree National Park called me up and asked me to come and document it. And you can read about that story in National Geographic now, which was a really, really great opportunity. And it was just super fun.
You've got me wanting to go see that now. That's really cool. So
It's really neat. Yeah, they have it too. You can see it too, a different species, Photurus fontinus, in Smoky Mountain National Park. So you have these different species that synchronize with one another. It was a really fun shoot. It was kind of maddening because it like flipped my whole hours. So let's run around in the woods photographing until 1 or 2 in the morning, and then come home, and it was just brutal.
see, I would have been right at home. I'm a horrible night owl.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's get on to the questions. Betsy asks, what cameras do you use?
I use numerous kinds of cameras. So my main camera brand that I use, if you're thinking about brands, is Canon. But I also have Sony and Nikon. So I use several different cameras. It just depends on what for. So at the moment, I have several cameras that are actually out in the field in camera traps that are connected to infrared sensors that are making images of otters and raccoons and bears while I'm in the comfort of my own home. Of course, those bears also destroy a lot of my equipment. So you got to take the bad with the good. But yeah, I have a lot of gear. I don't know if you have a more specific question about that, but yeah, many different kinds of cameras, many different quality cameras. But here's the thing: if you're a photographer, it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Like the images that I made, for example, the snail kite shot, that image should have never ever been attempted to be made with the camera body that I made it with. Like it was like a 3 frames per second camera, like that for a bird that is going like meow. Like it's all just about how you see the world and what you see. So while camera companies have been very good about marketing their latest and greatest equipment, it's not about that. It's about how you see and what you see. So I use stuff that is long obsolete. I still do. And I've never once had a magazine that said, we can't publish this because it's made on an old camera body. So.
Fair enough. Patricia, not me, but a different Patricia, asks, how did you get involved with National Geographic?
National Geographic is, I've been involved with them for a while now in many different capacities, but I became a grantee 2 years ago with their Explorer program. So I applied for a grant through their storytelling grant to help tell and fund this old growth story that I've been working on. So through that affiliation, they have now taken interest in the story, and they've run several stories off of this project. One of them being the fireflies that we were just talking about. Another one being a quest to solve the long debated and long held question of who or what pollinates the ghost orchid, which is another really cool story and endeavor we undertook in the swamps of South Florida. So yeah, it's been a long road to get there.
Marvelous. Saul comments and then he asks a question. Most who have ventured into wildlife photography know the ethic of not disturbing wildlife. Many places prohibit drones because they are a nuisance to wildlife and ruin the outdoor experience for others. Yet, drones have captured compelling images and interesting perspectives. What are your thoughts on drones and wildlife photography?
Great question, and an important question. So I think there are kind of two questions there. One that relates to drones and one that relates to wildlife, or do you want to know my thoughts on, well, whatever. I'll just give you both. So drones are great. I use them a lot, but I try to use them only in appropriate areas. I also hate being outside and all of a sudden there's this, sounds like a swarm of bees around you from other people flying drones. But I typically work in very remote places where there aren't going to be people. Drones aren't allowed in national parks, so that's a really good policy, I believe. I think a lot of times people are using drones as toys, and that's totally fine. But I think there should be an ethic and there should be a consciousness around not ruining outdoor experiences for other people's. I use drones in very specific goal-oriented situations. Whether it's for campaigns to help show a larger context of a landscape. It pretty much lives in my car, so I mean, it's been a game changer for me. I love drone photography because it used to be that I'd have to hire a pilot, and you're paying anywhere from $400 to $800 an hour to go fly. And then everything's based on conditions, and you can't just call that morning. So drones have been instrumental in helping tell larger, more impactful stories. But there's also a time and place for them. They're not the end all be all, and maybe they're overused by some people. And in terms of how they are for wildlife, gosh, I've seen so much terrible use of drones around wildlife. I was watching a video the other day, and someone was flying a drone right over this flock of flamingos, and it just looked really stressed out. So I don't know. I think anytime if you're working with wildlife or if you're impacting wildlife, you should either be with a wildlife biologist, someone who knows these animals and knows their behavior, or you should probably refrain from getting that close and impacting their behaviors.
Fair enough. And then Betsy chimed back in and asked, film or digital or both?
I'm all digital now. I used to be film, and I haven't shot film since 2005. So I love digital. I remember back in the day when I would miss so many images because my film would just run out. 36 images is not enough. So yeah, I'm all digital and all about it.
Okay.
But I do think there's a responsibility, though. If people are looking at your work as photojournalism, and if they're looking at it as to be a depiction of the truth, I think you also need to make sure that you divulge anything that would compromise, what is ethical or what is real.
Fair enough. Saul also chimed in again. He said, "Thank you, Mac. Love your Everglades book."
Oh, cool. Thanks, all.
So does anyone else have any other questions? Now is the time to write them in the chat. If you've got anything else you would like to ask Mac that we didn't cover, any burning questions? I don't see anything coming up. Let me see. Um, Oh, one thing I wanted to ask real quick, I'll give somebody else time to ask more questions if they would like. This may sound like a silly question, but I think for you, it does absolutely play a part in your ethos. How do you come up with your titles?
Oh, of the images?
Mm-hmm.
Oh gosh, that's like one of the most stressful things. I don't know. I've actually polled the audience before on several of them. My wife is my muse, and she's brilliant, and she comes up with titles sometimes. So yeah, I don't know. It just depends how I felt at the time, either when I made it, what it reminds me of. Yeah.
Okay. We have another question that came in. Catherine asks, the image behind you, is it yours? And where is it from?
It sure is. This is another old growth swamp. This is actually the oldest known swamp in the world. This is on the Black River in North Carolina. And a dendrochronologist recently discovered a 2,624-year-old cypress tree in this swamp, which is what makes it the oldest swamp in the world. Previously, before that, the oldest known cypress tree was 1,700 years old. So um, this is a really fascinating, beautiful place that I've had the great privilege to get to know and experience and photograph. Like the knees, these structures, these root structures right behind me, they're in many cases 12, 15 feet tall. Just this primordial place. It's really, really something.
That's gorgeous. Any minute, a diplodocus is going to wander by in the background.
Yeah. That's exactly right. That's how it feels there. I think that's what I always have loved about swamps, is that they just feel old and wise, and they just, I don't know, they remind me of Jurassic Park or Land Before Time.
Marvelous. Ginger has a question. Was Hang the Moon published as a single photo?
That one that you saw was published as a single photo in some National Geographic online thing. But it was also published around in different backpacker and outside, different magazines and places. I think Bing, Bing had it as its homepage for some time. So yeah, and there's many different images from it. You can find them on my website if you go to the Explore tab.
Marvelous. Well, I don't see any more questions, but I did want to mention that Mac's work is on view currently at the Appleton, and he also very kindly gave us permission to show the making of the image, The Hunt, with the beautiful snail kite coming down. That is alongside his image at the Appleton as well. It is in a larger show entitled Visions of Florida. And the next person that I'm going to be interviewing in the Artist Outlook series is Mark Messer-Smith. And he has very gorgeous, huge, large scale paintings. We have 3 of them that we own at the Appleton. And he will also be he actually is on view right now in that same show, Visions of Florida. So we invite you to come look at that. We are open from Thursday through Saturday now from 10 to 5. And then Sunday noon to 5. So please come and check it out. And then also the next Artist Outlook that I mentioned, that will be on Thursday, January the 21st at 7 p.m. So please do come. Thank you, Mac. Thank you so much. This was great fun getting to know you better and talk about your work. We very much appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me. This is great. Your questions were awesome, and everyone was excellent. Thank you, everyone else, for your questions too. And I'm thrilled. I hope to get to see you again. And once this old growth project finishes up, hopefully we can do this again.
Well, that would be delightful. We would love that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We so appreciate your help and support. We love you. We need you. And we're really grateful that you spent your Thursday evening with us. Thank you so much and have a great evening and happy holidays. Take good care.